When I first heard what Ben Carlin was proposing to do, I could hardly believe it. In fact, I thought he was out of his mind. But the more I read into the story, the more I realized this man was quite extraordinary. He needed an extraordinary amount of self-confidence and complete audacity to try and pull this off. There's a wonderful Yiddish word, it's chutzpah. He needed a large amount of chutzpah to be able to pull this off. And what was his idea? Well, he was going to buy a 1942 Ford GPA. That's a general purpose amphibious vehicle built for the Second World War to travel around the world. In itself, not that challenging a proposition, but Ben Carlin was going to go clean across the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and the same across the Pacific Ocean, as well as driving the highways and byways in between. Food for thought, I had to say. I know a little about provisioning a vehicle to go across a distance, and I know something about provisioning a deep water ocean sailboat, or in fact a trawler, to go across an ocean. But Ben was proposing to do this in a 4x4 that was barely waterproofed. That needed some overthought. The other challenge is that I know something about amphibious vehicles, having built an amphibus for an organization in Toronto, and I was part of the engineering and design and implementation team, which was quite different from taking a 4x4 built for the Second World War and putting it across the Atlantic Ocean. So let's back up the story a bit and talk about Ben Carlin himself. He was born in Australia and spent his initial schooling at Guildford Grammar School, after which he went to the University of Western Australia, WWII, but he didn't graduate. And he then bounced around various types of work in the outback, in mining, in general construction, working in farming, but always building on his natural talent as an untrained field engineer. In 1939, Ben wanted to become part of the war effort, but he couldn't quite get to Europe. So he signed up to join the Indian Army as an actual field engineer. And towards the end of the war, that's when this conversation turned towards his trip around the world. He was chatting with a fellow officer, kicking the tires of this 4x4 he saw in the vehicle pound. And it was one of those situations where he just needed somebody to contradict an idea for him to adopt that idea and start using it as a life goal. Well, what was his plan? He was kicking the tires of an old 4x4, in fact a GPA built in 1942. It was a pretty ugly type of a vehicle in some sense, but it had an air of purposefulness about it. It was designed by the naval architectural firm of Sparkmans and Stevens and built by Ford in Dearborn at their Rouge River plant. His plan was essentially to drive it around the world, but not through the highways and byways. Ben decided he was going to go clean across the Atlantic Ocean with this waterproof Jeep and then travel across the Pacific Ocean in the same way, and then he'd drive the highways and byways. It was one of those extraordinary madcap journeys that needed immense amounts of planning, but Ben was not essentially a planner. He was a doer. I know a little about motoring across oceans, and one of my plans was to replicate those same ocean crossings in a purpose-built, seaworthy and well-tested deep-water trawler. I abandoned my original hobby of sailing mostly because the wind was almost wanting to blow me somewhere I didn't want to go. And the idea of turning on my diesels and simply pointing the ship where I wanted to go was a heck of a lot more attractive. I did quite a bit of research into passage making, and my first difference of opinion with Ben would have been fuel. And while this plucky Australian eventually ended up with close to 800 gallons of highly flammable gasoline, I'd be carrying diesel, which was far less flammable and, in my opinion, a great deal safer. Not only that, Ben was converting what looked like a mechanical brick into a transoceanic vessel with only modest storage. He also had 8 inches of freeboard between the water itself and the top of the Jeep. And I'm thinking that was a huge challenge. He also had a relatively flat bottom hull, and he desperately needed more gas, so he created a kind of an under Jeep tank system where he would strap supplies of gasoline underneath the Jeep and proceed across the ocean, siphoning it off whenever he needed. Ben was demobbed from the Army in 1946, whereupon he headed straight to the United States, where he thought he might find a used Ford GPA at an affordable price. Luckily for him, the US were disposing of war assets, and as fortune would have it, a GPA was being offered for auction, and his bid of $901 took the prize. He drove it off the lot, and on the way to a boatyard where he had reserved some space, he was fixing headlamps, he was fixing fan belts, he was fixing the carburetor. In fact, he was repairing the GPA as he went to his boatyard. In Detroit, they built this amphibian in the Ford Rouge plant, kind of a cross between a Jeep and a DUKW, a duck. It built between 1942 and 1943, and to give you an idea of the production run, they produced 12,700. In the same period, the Jeep company, manufacturing the actual Jeep, produced 650,000 models. So you can see that the GPA was a bit of a dog. It was too slow on land and extremely unwieldy in the water, and Ben's successful bid of $901 was about what the thing was worth. This wonderful World War II film shows a group of US squaddies training with the GPA. You can see that they're assembled and climbing into them, and then they just fling them into the water off a riverbank, one after the other, and get some idea of how stable or unstable these were in the river. While in India, he'd met Elinore Arone, a young US Red Cross nurse, and he had a stormy relationship with her, which ended when she took off to China. People keep in touch as they do, and when he got to the US, they were still in touch, with Elinore insisting she ride alongside for the test voyages of Half Safe. And in this clip, you can see the GPA swing to the left as Ben makes a slight right turn. Doesn't look that stable to me, I have to say. In fact, Elinore remained with Ben throughout each of his test runs and on every one of his false starts before he eventually took off across the Atlantic. How did he equip Half Safe, and how did he modify it into a little ship? Well, he essentially bought an open 4x4 truck wrapped in a thin sheet of steel to resemble a boat, and to contemplate going across a pond, let alone the Atlantic, you'd need to think deeply and carefully about how to go forth. And here is another interesting US Army clip where you can see the young soldiers again flinging their GPAs into the water, having a whale of a time, and you can get some idea of how unstable they are as the wave comes back and hits them, and often when they're quite close together, they're very difficult to control. The main issue Ben had was how to stash sufficient fuel to cross the Atlantic from his fourth departure point of Halifax, Nova Scotia, to the Canary Islands and onwards to North Africa. Not only that, Ben had to carry sufficient food for the journey, plus some reserve oil for his engine. He needed emergency supplies, he needed a life raft for an abandoned ship potential, a radio of course, and whatever clothes they needed for a landfall somewhere on the other side. And this is where it got complicated, because there was no way the small gas tank on Half Safe could take them out of sight of land, let alone across the Atlantic. So Ben fabricated a 300-gallon belly tank, which we would strap to the underneath of Half Safe, and then a 25-gallon tank between the radiator and the bow of his little ship, plus a few jerry cans stashed wherever he could on board Half Safe. He had about 500 gallons of highly flammable gas, as opposed to diesel. To create a living cabin, he boxed in the top of the GPA and created a small protected space which would in theory keep the ocean out of his little ship. Here we can see Ben working in his boatyard workshop, trying to get the vehicle in shape, and a great smile from Elinore as she looked on and gave him some encouragement. Ben and Elinore were real partners in crime and did everything they possibly could to make this a success. Into this space he built a bunk, a toilet, and as much storage as he could possibly figure out.
If the truth be known, there wasn't really much space to sleep or stretch out or do anything other than drive and work the radio en route.
But given the poor spot welds I've seen on some of these World War II utility vehicles, I thought his idea of seaming the entire vehicle and welding those seams was an inspirational approach. He also had another great idea, which was to cover the entire hull in neoprene, and that might just have saved his life. So let's talk about his first try. In the late fall, he planned to sail and motor across the Chesapeake Bay into the Delaware River, and from there into the Atlantic, and then go a couple of 100 miles across to Manhattan. This turned out to be a complete disaster, mainly due to lack of visibility through an iced-up windshield, and eventually he ended up ramming a concrete pier, creating a gaping hole in the bow, which he eventually welded over and quite sensibly continued by road up to Manhattan. Elinore and Ben were married a short time later, and before they attempted their next run on the Atlantic, think about that as a honeymoon, by the way, this was tough going, as the tide was seemingly always against them, and their modest engine in half safe could hardly make any progress.
And as they slipped past the Statue of Liberty, their speed started to decrease until they were hardly making any way at all.
And at this speed, he figured it would take him 25 days, if all went well, to get to the other side. Well, unfortunately, the dynamics of this motorized brick did not take kindly to the strength of the winds or the wave action, and it could hardly keep a straight course, needing a second-by-second correcting hand on the steering wheel, which in turn spun the tiny rudder at the aft end of the ship. They were exhausted, and they were compelled to shut down for the night and get some rest while the weather took complete control of their destiny. This went on for another 24 to 36 hours, when a dull thumping sound kept resonating through the ship. The only thing Ben could do was to strip off and dive overboard mid-Atlantic, where he found the auxiliary fuel tanks had come loose beneath the hull and were bashing into the side of half safe. He was compelled to cut them loose, and realizing the dilemma this posed for him, with no fuel for the ocean crossing and incredible headaches from possible CO2 fumes penetrating the cabin, Ben and Elinore were forced to turn back yet again after making only 35 miles into the Atlantic. They eventually tied up to a pier in New Jersey. Their second attempt was somewhat more successful, and very quietly Ben and Elinore and Half Safe slipped quietly down the Hudson River, not far from the aft end of the massive Queen Mary, which was waiting for a fresh complement of guests who were also heading across the Atlantic, in somewhat more comfort, I would say. Once more, they ran into an issue. First, they had a cracked exhaust system, which allowed nausea-causing gas into the cabin, and then they were hit with a deteriorating weather system right in their path.
Half Safe was a bit of a handful in normal circumstances, but when you're looking at this kind of weather, it became almost unmanageable.
A couple of days later, it's around July 15, the couple had to alter course and head back into Brooklyn Harbor, where they tied up for a massive rethink. It's now August the 7th, and their third attempt, and as determined as ever, even with their previous battering in mind, they set off again in an attempt to cross the Atlantic. They were about 100 miles east of North American continent, and they were visited by several U.S. Navy ships, and a destroyer pulled alongside and asked them to stop and be investigated. I guess they were looking over the ship to see if it was safe, and after refusing to be rescued, the ship's departed company and Half Safe continued her eastward journey towards Europe. At this point, they're mid-Atlantic, and Ben needed to inspect the hull, so he dove off again and scraped some of the debris from beneath the ship. It's now August 13th, and the rain was pelting down on Half Safe, which was beginning to experience intermittent engine trouble, needing Ben to constantly climb over the front of the ship, dive into the engine compartment, analyze what's gone wrong, and fix it. Ben and Elinore realized they had under-provisioned the ship, and they'd forgotten to take along a whole bunch of spare parts, particularly. They were by now 300 miles into the Atlantic, and with potentially more engine trouble ahead and insufficient fuel and water, they decided to stop and take stock of their situation. Unfortunately, they had great difficulty restarting the engine, and when it finally did start, they realized they were in trouble. They looked at the life raft on top of their cabin, and they looked at each other, and as the waves were just pounding against them, Ben decided he would try an old World War II trick, which was to pour oil on the water in an attempt to reduce the pounding. However, at this time, they hadn't been able to check in by radio, so their sponsors in New York were alerting the Coast Guard, who were alerting all transatlantic shipping and any aircraft traveling in the region. The Coast Guard was particularly concerned that they may have experienced some engine trouble. It's almost hard to contemplate, but after 10 days drifting with a totally inoperable engine, they were spotted by a freighter which came alongside and offered to take the two of them on board, but eventually the captain realized there was some value to HalfSafe, and so he managed to lift the amphibian clean onto the deck, where they continued to Montreal, arriving on August the 30th. By now, it was too far advanced towards the winter for Ben and Elinore to continue across the Atlantic, so Ben set about re-engineering HalfSafe, while Elinore flew down to Florida, where she was able to raise funds by working as a secretary.
News of their extraordinary voyage was now spreading, and wherever they went, they were besieged with people wanting to take a look and understand exactly what this was all about.
They're now going to try a fourth attempt crossing of the Atlantic. Ben was really disenchanted with the location of his fuel supply strapped beneath the hull. It didn't obviously work. So his idea was to use two 150-gallon World War II surplus aircraft drop tanks and tow them behind HalfSafe full of fuel.
On the surface, this was an interesting idea, but in practicality, it presented a number of issues.
So as he crossed the Atlantic, his idea was to use the fuel from the drop tanks to replenish the main tank in HalfSafe and continue across to North Africa. So he tried to figure this out by towing the cans up and down the harbour in Halifax, but it was an absolute disaster. The cans kept hitting the ship, and he had no way of controlling them.
The main problem Ben saw was the potential of the cans hitting the hull and making a hole in HalfSafe.
So Ben had to stop and really think about his process. And given the distance that he had to go and the fact that the cans were going to be hitting the ship with perhaps disastrous results, he figured he had to do something different. And it's at this point that he realized that his grit and determination, his amazing chutzpah, and his depth of willpower to succeed was not going to be sufficient. Ben realized that he needed to change from an action man to a planning man and take a more seaman-like approach to what was an awesome challenge.
Happily, this was just yet another chance for our wonderful Australian adventurer, and with the help of his wife, he soon figured most of this out.
They're now approaching their fifth attempt. It's 1950, and one of Ben's modifications using fins and stabilizers on the towed fuel system looked as though it might just work. They were now at the base in Shearwater, close to Halifax, ready for the next attempt, and on 19 July they set out once more across the Atlantic Ocean. This time, Ben and Elinore had stashed sufficient food and water for 6 weeks, and Ben had an unbelievable 800 gallons of gasoline on board and towed behind in order to get across the Atlantic to Europe.
This was their final attempt, and they were throwing everything they possibly could into the action to try and succeed.
With this exceptional weight, HalfSafe rode very low in the water with a dangerous 8 inches of freeboard between the water and the top of the ship. Not very acceptable going across the Atlantic. Okay for a farm pond, but towing 600 to 800 gallons of gas behind, and with that level of freeboard, it was an extremely hostile environment. Amazingly, on the third day of his fifth attempt crossing the Atlantic, their log recorded an extraordinary 125 miles achieved, which I would never have thought possible. His average speed would have been about 5 miles an hour, and in calm weather and a smooth running engine, Ben was clearly living the dream. Luckily, Ben was also a highly accomplished Mr. Fix-It, and as leaking hoses, decaying drive shaft couplings, and various water leaks and oiled up plugs were part of the course, they were well within the capabilities of this extraordinary and talented Australian adventurer. Ben was also able to transfer fuel when needed from the tanks being towed behind Half Safe. This meant he had to frequently dive into the Atlantic, couple up a series of hoses, and ensure the fuel flowed from the tanks into Half Safe. He also had to dive underneath the ship several times to cut loose a useless large ballast tank which they'd basically tied to the bottom of Half Safe. This nearly capsized the ship because our hero had to spend almost 8 hours underneath cutting the tanks free in order to let the ballast sink towards the ocean floor. By mid-August, the weather had changed from being rather cool on the North American side to quite warm and flat, and the days turned into weeks, with Ben doing running repairs and Elinore assisting all the time, navigating, watch-keeping, holding the wheel and keeping their course. Ben was working really hard to keep the 4-cylinder engine in the GPA running, which was manageable in warm and rather flat weather. However, when the wind came up and Half Safe was tossed around like a cork in a bottle, Ben's repair jobs became an absolute nightmare. It's now 19th of August, 1950, and the island of Flores in the Portuguese Azores came into view over the horizon, and after 30-plus days at sea, they'd conquered the Atlantic and were attached finally to the seawall in the Portuguese Azores. Canada to the Azores took a tremendous effort to navigate over a rather difficult Atlantic in a waterproofed, crudely built 1942 ex-military 4x4 vehicle.
And to refresh our memories, let's just take another look at these plucky US soldiers who are trying out their GPAs, having difficulty navigating close to each other.
Extraordinary. After a short rest in Flores, they sailed over to the island of Fayal and then another 26 hours to Terceira, where they stayed at the Officers Club at the US base in the Azores. I stand by my initial thoughts about how dangerous Half Safe would be on an Atlantic crossing. After all, Ben was driving a brick-shaped 4x4 across the entire center of the Atlantic Ocean. But Bren had proved this could be done, and in his case with less planning and initial equipment than I would have undertaken on a similar journey. A final example of how Ben Carlin was able to succeed and overcome all obstacles was the dangerous storm which he and Elinore experienced on the next leg across to the North African continent. They were hit with 3 days and nights of hurricane velocity winds which tossed Half Safe around like a little cork in a bottle. It did not possess any of the marine dynamics and techniques which a sailboat or a trawler could use, and in many respects she was a floating brick. Water was pouring into Half Safe quicker than they could pump it back overboard, and any thought about abandoning ship and using the life raft was totally out of question.
And as you can see from this photograph, it must have been extremely difficult to move outside on Half Safe, let alone detach a life raft in the middle of a storm,
because the winds were too high to even inflate it. They were frequently spun broadside to the oncoming waves, which is a disaster for any boat. The hull was being pounded from the side, and the plexiglass windows were fracturing one by one with the sheer weight of water that was hitting them. Now, how Half Safe survived is a total mystery to me, but this must be due to Ben Carlin's exceptional personality, his extraordinary skill, his stubbornness, his absolute refusal to surrender, and his will to survive, extreme chutzpah in a way. When asked how he survived that enormous storm, Ben pointed out that his low freeboard and the general low profile of Half Safe probably was an asset in a storm like that, because it presented a low in the water target for the waves and thus took a minimal pounding compared to a larger ship with greater above water profile. So their onward journey took them to the island of Lanzarote in the Canary Islands, and on 23 February 1951 they continued east and sighted the North African coastline, where they splashed ashore close to the ancient British fort at Casamar.
There are very few clips of Half-Safe coming out of the ocean, but this will give you some idea of her ability to come onto the beach and generally get the wheels moving. The rudder, of course, is steering, the propeller is propelling, and she slowly climbs onto the terra firma. And here, of course, we have Ben preparing for his picnic.
After sailing out of Halifax harbour, they had crossed the entire Atlantic Ocean in a floating brick virtually, and were now ready for the remaining part of their adventure around the world. Ben and Elinore were able to continue through North Africa,
and one can only wonder what these Moroccan tribesmen were thinking about Half-Safe.
And then most of Europe by land, and eventually traverse the Pacific Ocean in Half-Safe.
Before they were able to do this, they spent quite a bit of time in the UK refitting the vehicle, re-welding some of the seams, and of course trying to reprovision. And Elinore and Ben just spent so much time on the road, they wanted to get this right.
But that's another story for another time. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Stories for Grown-Ups. The story of Ben and Elinore and Half-Safe is truly, I think, one of the great adventure stories of our modern age, and I take my hat off to both of them.